You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-Jorge, and I am a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. A quick note before we get onto this interview. At time of recording, George Harding-Rolls worked on fashion, plastics, and circular economy at Changing Markets Foundation. He is now Director of Advocacy at EcoAge and Fossil Fuel Fashion Campaign Lead. So welcome to the second episode of our two-parter with George Harding-Rolls. Welcome back, George.
Thank you, Barbara.
I'm really keen to talk to you about one of my favorite sustainability communications tool, the greenwash.com platform. So I believe you set it up. How does it work, and why have you chosen to focus on fashion, plastics, and food?
Yeah, so the background to it is we purchased the domain greenwash.com, about 3 years ago on just a whim. This is probably a good thing to have. There's lots going on in greenwashing.
Smart.
We didn't know exactly what we were going to use it for. And then the opportunity, so I helped to write a report on the fashion industry called Synthetics Anonymous, where we looked at the fashion industry's over-reliance on plastic fibers, which are actually derived from oil and gas, like polyester. They're kind of the workhorse of the fashion industry, the backbone of the fashion industry, and they're what allow companies to produce mountains of cheap clothing, but also because they're made of plastic, that poses huge problems to recycling. And then when they end up landfilled or incinerated, obviously that's has huge environmental consequences as well. When we reached out to these companies, we looked at their not only their usage of synthetics, but any green claims that they were making on top of them. And this was before the current crackdown on greenwashing had really happened. We had only the Competition and Markets Authority's Green Claims Code, which we used as our basis to decide if it was greenwashing or not. What we found was that 59% of fashion brands' green claims were unsubstantiated or misleading. So we had all these examples from the fashion industry and this amazing statistic. And then we just decided around London Fashion Week 2022 that this was the time to turn it into something. So we built out greenwash.com with all those fashion examples. I went to London Fashion Week uninvited, dressed as a washing machine, and danced around outside and asked people if they knew what greenwashing was, which was possibly the highlight and low light of my career because it's led to some amazing things, but it was so cringeworthy at the time. I remember feeling incredibly embarrassed. And then since then, we've expanded out to other sectors. We've expanded into plastic packaging sector. We recently did food, particular focus on meat and dairy, all with the aim of showing people what greenwashing looks like in the wild. Because I think people can quite easily get their head around the concept and are quite familiar with it. But in terms of identifying what it looks like, is this product making a substantiated green claim, or is it just hot air? Which of the companies who are doing it, what kind of resources do we need to tackle it? That's really what greenwash.com has been about. It's spun out now into really its own separate campaign, own kind of social media presence, where we're currently going through a process of speaking to high profile people in the sustainability space about their thoughts on greenwashing, about how to tackle it. So yeah, I think it's aimed at being a awareness raising platform and a platform to kind of take action as well.
So you mentioned that the reason why you created it is because you wanted people to spot greenwashing in the wild, to use your words. So is it primarily for consumers or other stakeholders as well? So what do you want consumers, companies, and other people to get out of it? Is it awareness raising? Is it for activism? All of the above?
Yeah, it's all of the above, really. I think we take a kind of broad brush approach to our audiences. For a lot of campaign launches and things like that, we always ask, like, who's your audience? Who's your audience? And genuinely, we tend to say, I mean, it's everybody, and you never know who's going to come out of the woodwork. We put things out which have not been aimed at policymakers. We've had a huge amount of policymaker interest, likewise journalists, etc. So primarily, it's consumers of those kind of products to help raise awareness and also empower them to call out brands and companies for greenwashing. But we've also done a lot of advocacy work using greenwash.com. particularly in the EU. So, for example, with the Green Claims Directive, prior to that, we sent all of our documentation reports, greenwash.com, to the EU Commission, and the same with our previous reports as well, because they need to be empowered to know what kind of green claims are out there, what are the ones that are spurious, and what kind of substantiation makes sense in that context.
So obviously the way that we've talked about sustainability and greenwashing has been fairly negative in these two parts of these episodes. So could you maybe give us some examples of companies doing good sustainability communications to kind of inspire our listeners, or maybe for those people working in marketing or communications, prick up their ears to watch out for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd hesitate to name any specific company without being like completely up to date on what their marketing looks like. So I can keep it kind of in general terms. I think the Competition and Markets Authority's principles, their green claim code has 6 principles in it to watch out for as a company to kind of check every claim you're making against. In my mind, it's actually slightly clearer than the Green Claims Directive, which is still a bit of a mess in terms of what it is actually requiring for companies and actually what they need to do. So I think in the kind of meantime, that's the place to look, the Competition and Markets Authority. So it's things like considering the full life cycle of the product. A good example of that would be the use of, again, recycled plastic bottles for clothing. That when you talk about the environmental benefit of that, you're talking about it in like a very, very narrow perspective. You're not actually talking about the end of life and the recycling options for that piece of clothing, or the fact that it kind of upstream, maybe making things slightly less circular in the beverage industry sector. Another example would be, well, I mean, that's also about not omitting important information about a product. So not just focusing on the fact that it's recycled plastic bottles and not the fact that it is still plastic, or that its end of life options are slightly limited. So another one would be just avoiding vague claims, avoiding those buzzwords. They're not really adding anything, and particularly if you can't substantiate exactly what you mean by it. If you can, if you're tempted to use the word circular and what you really mean is that you have a repair service, then talk about the repair service in a lot of detail, but don't kind of use those buzzwords without that substantiation. I think in general terms, what I'm looking for as somebody who campaigns on greenwashing or against greenwashing, is a level of authenticity and honesty that mainstream companies aren't really showing. And that actually oftentimes the right kind of communication on it I'll see from smaller brands, brands that are often owned and run by one person, where they know the ins and outs of their supply chain. They've often visited the country where their supply base is. They are just much more honest and authentic about their communications, including the challenges of it. And I think that's where it's a hard line to tread, because if you start seeing a large brand, a large company saying, we actually don't know like what happens to these products at the end of life, or like we're trying our hardest to source the best materials that we can, this is what we can tell you so far. That level of authenticity you can get from a smaller brand, but from a larger brand, we expect them to know the answers. So it's a level of transparency for sure, about what you know, what you don't know, what it's possible to know, and what it's still difficult to find out. And then ultimately, I think one of the major mistakes that we make as society as a whole, in terms of our efforts towards sustainability, is thinking that the whole system will change if only we have a market saturated with green products. It is part of the goals of the EU to improve the availability of sustainable products, make it easier for consumers to make the right choices. But I just think this whole notion of putting it all on consumers is a massive distraction tactic from this need to create systemic change, from this need to shift from putting all of our eggs in the corporate sustainability basket and actually none in the kind of legislation on sustainability basket. So we are not going to overnight reduce consumerism to planet-friendly levels by just providing a whole load of green products. We actually have to have a much larger conversation about overconsumption as well, and how we get there from a legislative perspective rather than from a voluntary perspective.
Picking up on your point about openness and transparency, so I also advise companies when they're talking about sustainability to be as transparent as possible, to open up about their challenges, because too often companies only focus on the positives, and not only do they not show the challenges, they don't explain honestly, look, we're doing this because of regulation, or we're doing this because one of our customers asked us to. And very often the feedback that I get is, well, we if we show that we're being transparent in a way that our competitors are not, that makes us vulnerable, which is this kind of paradox, because people can also see through the fact that they're not talking about them. So what advice would you give to companies who want to be a bit more transparent but are kind of scared of taking that leap when they're in a sector that no one else is doing that?
Yeah, so I would say, and this is my kind of drum that I'm banging at the moment, in terms of my theory of change of what is needed in the sustainability sector, which I've been sort of thinking about a lot over my time working at changing markets. Um, when companies do everything that they can within their own remit, within their own kind of sustainability efforts, without thinking how to change the rules of the game, for their own benefit, they're not going far enough by a long chalk to be as impactful as they can, given their position of power. So take the transparency thing, for example. A company might be making every effort it can to trace its supply chains and trace its kind of downstream end of life impacts of its products, if it's in that kind of sector, and making sure it's got all its ducks in a row internally, and not be communicating about it transparently yet. My advice would be to engage in processes like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, to make it mandatory for transparency, make that level of transparency mandatory for companies, because then you've got the first mover advantage, while all these other companies will be scrabbling around to get that level of traceability and disclose. You'll already be there, and you can be focusing on other things, or you can be communicating about it in an authentic way. So it's about encouraging brands to be brave, to be advocates, to engage in lobbying on a good level, rather than, very often when companies lobby, they lobby to keep the status quo, or to slow things down, or to give themselves time. But there is such a huge advantage that I don't think many companies understand in leveling the playing field across the sustainability sector to your advantage by going for the most ambitious legislative options there are, by lobbying policymakers to make sure that environmental, social legislation is as ambitious as it can be. Because if you are ahead of the game, if you are as committed to sustainability as you say you are as a company, then you will have a huge first mover's advantage, and you'll also have kind of changed the rules of the game. As I feel like I've said change the rules of the game about 50 times during this podcast.
So yeah, take the opportunity, I suppose, that's being provided by regulation at the moment. So yeah, I mean, I think in society broadly, there is this widespread acceptance of the urgency of climate action, and it's clear there's a gap. So an example I always like to use is from Raz Godalnik, who wrote a book called Rethinking Corporate Sustainability in the Era of Climate Change. And he said that we've moved from business as usual to sustainability as usual. So companies are doing stuff on sustainability, but it's still a little bit superficial. It's not going far enough. We need to move to what he calls awakened sustainability, which centers climate action and social justice, the E and the S of ESG. So how do you think we can reach that status of awakened sustainability? What needs to happen overall?
I mean, I think it's interesting that this sort of incremental change that we're seeing, this sustainability as usual, it's something that probably would have been acceptable about if we'd started 50 years ago. There's the various sort of modeling that suggests if we'd started reducing our carbon emissions by a couple of percent a year from 1990, then we just wouldn't need the massive, systemic shifts and the massive changes of direction that we need right now. So I think having a term like awakened sustainability is partially speaking to that increasing pressure, that increasing urgency that we're all feeling to take action. And the more time goes on, the more drastic that action has to look like. I mean, I'm not sure how helpful it is for the movement to have like another buzzword, to be quite honest, that people have to grapple with and get their heads around and communicate. Although I do fully support like the notion behind it. For me, I would say it goes back to what I was just talking about, the awakened element of it, of companies becoming advocates for the kind of legislative change that we need to see, for the kind of policy change that we need to see. Going back to an earlier analogy of, it's like playing a game of football or something where the players are trying to change the rules of the game, or the players are being entrusted with changing the rules of the game, how you score points, what the penalties are, etc., rather than getting the referees in or getting FIFA in to change the rules. I mean, this is very weird for me to say because I'm really not a football fan, so that's quite a departure. But yeah, I guess that's for me what that awakened, that understanding of systemic change, and how that can be enacted and how your role as an organization plays into that.
Thanks, George. I wanted to ask you, what greenwashing related campaigns do you have coming up at Changing Markets Foundation? Obviously, we talked about greenwash.com, but what's coming up in the pipeline?
We're focusing quite a lot more on food in the coming months, particularly leading up to COP in the autumn. Really focusing on like big ag, so big meat and dairy, and the ways that they use green claims to try and to downplay their impact, particularly with a focus on methane. We have a major campaign, which I actually don't work on, but on methane and how important it is that we tackle methane with a huge amount of urgency, an extremely potent greenhouse gas, but that degrades much quicker in the atmosphere than CO2 does. So acting on methane, massively reducing levels of methane coming from the agricultural sector, as well as the energy sector and the waste sector, can act as a bit of a climate emergency brake, and just give us a bit more time to play with. So we're going to be looking at the work we've done on the methane campaign with the kind of greenwashing lens as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel plastics and fashion, it makes sense as a sector to focus on. But yeah, I'm kind of interested and surprised that you've picked food and methane as something to focus on. Is it because you pinpointed that as a real, upcoming untapped problem, as you say, or another reason?
Yeah, I mean, it's within the food sector, a huge sector of very, very high emissions from meat and dairy, and we know that as an individual consumer, one of the best things you can do to reduce your own impact is to switch to a more plant-based diet. So we were looking really, so we produced a report about this called Feeding Us Greenwash a couple of months ago, as we announced the new sector on greenwash.com around food. Really looking at what are the green claims that are being used by the companies to try and assuage your guilt when you buy meat and dairy products. A huge amount of it, I think 60-80% plus of the claims that we found were around carbon neutrality. So offsetting the footprint of that product, or across the farm. A lot of milk products will have like CO2 neutral milk. Even beef products, some of the most carbon intensive foods out there. And really that's all part of the deception. And a lot of them, I mean, you take a look at greenwash.com for the kind of nitty gritty on how we debunked those claims. But a lot of them using some pretty interesting tactics to still make those claims whilst not actually changing the status quo.
So you work with a number of NGOs, and are there any that you're currently supporting that you'd like to highlight in this conversation?
Yeah, we've been working with two in the fashion and plastic sector for a while. I mean, we work with a lot of them, like Fashion Revolution, really, really great NGOs, really great movements. But there are two in particular that we've been working with over the last couple of years. The first one is Zero Waste Ukraine. We were working with them since before the Ukraine war on fashion. And then since that, we worked with them quite closely on a particular report called Dress to Kill, which is where we found supply chain links between Russian oil and major polyester producers, and then on to major fashion brands across the kind of global north. So discount Russian crude oil being used to make clothing, essentially, and then indirectly to fund kind of continued war efforts and war invasion of Ukraine. They're an amazing, a small team, but so tenacious. And even when the Ukraine war kicked off, we were in Slovenia with them, and they were just working so hard on issues of zero waste, even in a time of war, which was just incredible. And then the next one is one called Clean Up Kenya. We've been working with them for a number of years on plastics and fashion. And recently we did an on-the-ground investigation with them in Kenya into the used clothing trade. So looking at what happens to secondhand clothing, used clothing, when it's shipped to the global south. And it's a pretty unpleasant picture. We produced a documentary with them on it, which you can check out on our website. The report's called Trashin. They are just the most incredibly tenacious bunch of people engaging in the kind of policy advocacy side, the on-the-ground investigations, amazing activism, and just a super impactful organization that we're so proud to support.
Really interesting. Thanks, George, for giving those examples. So to wrap up this two-part episode, what do you feel is the number one mistake companies are making when communicating about sustainability? And conversely, if you had one piece of advice for companies who are keen to spot and avoid greenwashing, what would it be?
It would be assuming that the height of their ambitions should be providing the perfect green product rather than engaging in changing the rules of the game, so that there is a minimum required level of sustainability required across the market.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you to George for joining us today to talk about greenwashing and his work at the Changing Markets Foundation. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.